Xanthus crouched low behind the jagged limestone rocks, his breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. He was only 19, a scout whose only job was to report the movements of the Greek vanguard. But today, there was no movement to report, only a tidal wave of bronze and fury. Below him, the river Scamander, usually a bright and life-giving vein for the city of Troy, had turned into a thick, sluggish mire of dark red. The sun beat down on the plains, reflecting off the polished greaves of a single man who stood in the center of the current. Achilles did not look like a man. He looked like a natural disaster. Xanthus watched as the warrior moved with a fluidity that defied the laws of physics. He did not swing his sword with effort. He harvested lives as if he were a reaper in a summer wheat field. The Trojan soldiers, men Xanthus had shared bread with only hours ago, threw themselves into the water to escape him, but the river offered no sanctuary. The demigod stepped through the waist-deep water, his spear flashing like lightning, piercing through shields and breastplates as if they were made of parchment. The most horrific part was the silence of the hero. While the Trojans screamed for mercy or shouted prayers to Apollo, Achilles remained a statue of stone. His rage was not loud. It was a cold, vacuum-like force. Xanthus saw a veteran captain, a man known for his immense strength, challenge the Greek. With a single, casual flick of his wrist, Achilles parried the blow and drove his blade home. The captain fell into the silt, and the river rose higher, blocked by the growing mound of the dead. Xanthus felt a bead of sweat roll down his spine. He had heard the stories of the Myrmidons, the elite antmen who followed the son of Peleus, but they were nowhere to be seen. Achilles was alone. He had driven an entire division of the Trojan army into the riverbed by himself. The scout realized then that the war was no longer about a stolen queen or political borders. It had become a ritual of mourning for a fallen friend, Patroclus. Every life Achilles took was a coin paid to the ghost of his companion. The river began to groan, the water spirit itself protesting the desecration of its banks. Xanthus turned away, unable to watch the slaughter any longer, knowing that the ghost of this battle would haunt the soil of Troy forever.
The Greek camp was a place of iron, salt, and the smell of roasting meat, but inside the tent of the captive priestess Perseus, it felt like a tomb. She sat on a low wooden stool, her fingers tracing the intricate embroidery of a silk veil she no longer had a reason to wear. Through the heavy canvas flaps, she could hear the rhythmic clattering of armor. It was a sound she had grown to dread. It was the sound of the man who had destroyed her home, preparing to destroy her future. Perseus watched as Achilles sat on the edge of his cot. He was not the golden god the poets described. In the dim light of the oil lamps, he looked haunted. His eyes were sunken, rimmed with the red fatigue of a man who had forgotten how to sleep. Since the death of Patroclus, the hero had become a hollow shell filled with a dark, vibrating energy. He didn't speak to his servants or his soldiers. He simply sharpened his blade over and over, the rasp of the whetstone against the bronze sounding like a dying gasp in the quiet of the night. The horror of Achilles was not just found in his violence, but in his utter indifference to it. Perseus remembered the day he had returned from the river, his skin stained so deeply with gore that he looked like he had been dipped in wine. He hadn't washed. He had simply stood at the edge of the shore, staring toward the high walls of Troy with a gaze that could wither a forest. He was waiting for one man, Hector. The tension in the camp was thick enough to choke on. Even the other Greek kings, men like Agamemnon and Odysseus, walked softly when they passed his quarters. They recognized that they were no longer dealing with a soldier, but with a force of nature that had broken its leash. As the sun began to peek over the eastern horizon, Achilles rose. Perseus felt a chill sweep through the tent. He strapped on the divine armor forged by the smith god Hephaestus. The shield was a masterpiece of silver and gold, depicting the whole world's cities, weddings, harvests, and wars. It was a cruel irony that a man so dedicated to ending life carried the weight of the entire world on his arm. He didn't look at her as he stepped out into the morning air. From a distance, she heard the roar of the Greek army as he marched toward the Scaean gates. He began to circle the city, his voice a terrifying thunder as he called out Hector's name. The psychological warfare was devastating. Inside the city, Mothers held their children, and even the bravest guards trembled. Achilles wasn't just there to win a battle, he was there to erase the spirit of his enemies. Briseis knelt in the dirt of the tent floor, praying to gods she feared had already abandoned the sky, as the first sounds of bronze clashing against bronze drifted back from the plains.
Paris stood upon the high battlements of Troy, his hands trembling as he gripped a bough of polished horn. The wind whipped through his hair, carrying the metallic tang of blood and the smoke of funeral pyres. Below him, the plain was a scorched wasteland, a graveyard where the pride of Troy had been ground into the dust. He looked down at the figure of Achilles, who paced the earth like a caged beast. The hero was a blur of bronze and white plumes, his movement so fast it seemed to distort the very air around him. To Paris, Achilles did not appear as a man, but as a nightmare that had stayed awake long past the dawn. The prince reached into his quiver, his fingers brushing the fletching of a single, heavy arrow. He was not a warrior of the spear or the shield. He was a man of the shadows and the long reach. He watched as Achilles cut through a final line of Trojan defenders. There was no joy in the hero's face, only a bottomless, aching void where his soul used to be. Every time Achilles struck, he seemed to be trying to kill the grief that lived inside him. But the more he killed, the larger the shadows grew. Paris notched the arrow, pulling the string back until it pressed against his cheek. He prayed to Apollo, the god of light and order, asking for a single moment of clarity. He didn't aim for the chest or the head. Instead, he looked for the one place where the hero's mother, the sea nymph Thetis, had held him when she dipped him into the river Styx. As Achilles turned to shout a final defiance, his weight shifted, exposing the back of his heel. Paris released the string, and the arrow hissed through the air like a serpent. The impact was not loud, but the silence that followed was deafening. The arrow pierced the tendon. The Greek army froze. Achilles looked down at the shaft of wood protruding from his flesh, his face twisting in a mask of realization rather than pain. The spell was broken. He was suddenly, brutally mortal. He tried to stand, his pride forcing his body to move, but the strength that had leveled cities was draining into the sand. As the great hero finally collapsed, the earth seemed to let out a sigh of relief. The horrific cycle of his rage had come to an end. Paris lowered his bow, his heart heavy with a strange sadness. He realized that in killing the monster, he had only ensured that the legend would live forever. The body of Achilles lay still, a golden monument to the cost of war, and as the sun set behind the Greek ships, the long shadow of the fallen warrior stretched across the ruins of the world he had helped destroy.